1941, December. The declaration of war instantly shattered the routine of garrison life. It was replaced by the relentless urgency of invasion. For soldiers like Kawamata of the 214th Infantry Regiment, this meant sudden packing and preparation. Deployment culminated in a convoy of over 60 boats sailing south. They were escorted by the cruiser Natori. After a month at sea, punctuated by submarine alarms and distant explosions, the men finally understood their destiny. They were headed for Burma. In my house, their landing in Thailand was met with an unsettling, almost celebratory welcome. Thai locals waved the rising sun flag and shouted Nippon. Bangkok offered a brief deceptive respite of electric lamps and tree-lined roads. The true ordeal was about to begin. The strategic imperative was immediate and brutal. They had to secure the airfields at Tavoy and Victoria Point. This was necessary to protect the flank of the Malayan advance. This necessity launched the soldiers into a series of grueling jungle marches. These marches immediately exposed the chasm between strategic ambition and ground reality. Corporal Buhachiro Nakai, from the 55th Mountain Gun Regiment, recounted the torment of this initial advance. Poorly equipped and armed with old rifles, the men were forced to discard essential gear. They even threw away their steel helmets simply to conserve energy. They carried a week's rations on their shoulders. They stumbled over rough terrain, steep cliffs, and through dense jungle. The jungle was choked with tall, thick bamboo. The relentless heat left their uniforms perpetually wet. Blisters covered the soles of their feet. This forced march became the hardest experience many would ever know. As supplies dwindled, the myth of an effortless conquest evaporated. It was replaced by the desperate reality of hunger. Soldiers resorted to eating oxen. They peeled off the skin of paddy to eat the raw rice grains. The first contact with the enemy around Tavoy was a shock. The sound of rifles signaled the true start of the war. Captain Tadashi Suzuki prepared his men for a tense night attack. He ordered bayonets to be dulled with mud. This was to prevent any reflection that might betray their infiltration. Near the Bilin River, Kawamata's company encountered British armoured cars. Their armour-piercing bullets proved frustratingly ineffective against the Allied vehicles. When the subsequent bombardment ceased, an eerie, unsettling silence fell over the battlefield. It intensified the uncertainty of the immediate aftermath. The campaign swiftly reached its first critical turning point at the Sitang River. Sapper Yoshizo Abe detailed the intense fighting that culminated in the dramatic demolition of the Sitang Bridge. It was destroyed by the retreating British forces. The explosion was immense. It created a massive logistical hurdle for the Japanese engineers. They were forced to hastily construct a temporary wooden plank bridge. The blast also killed many fish in the river, a stark and visceral image of destruction. Private Shiro Tokita, securing a hill overlooking the river, witnessed the aftermath. He saw captured enemy equipment. He watched Indian soldiers swimming desperately across the turbulent waters, trapped by the premature blast. With the Sitang barrier breached, Lance Corporal Topotaro Mizushima's unit received orders for a swift 60-kilometer dash to Rangoon. Rangoon was the capital and the main Allied supply hub. Their shouts of banzai echoed their anticipation. On March 8, 1942, at 8:50 a.m., Kawamata's company entered the city. Yet the moment was anticlimactic. Upon entering, they were met by the naval landing force. The naval troops had arrived first, stealing the glory from the exhausted infantry. The infantry had endured the arduous overland journey. 40 minutes later, at 9:55 a.m., Corporal Toshio Miura officially reported the occupation. They hoisted the Japanese flag on the governor's building. The swift, brutal advance had secured a vital strategic victory, but the immediate reality for the troops was a temporary paradise of respite and captured goods. Dr. Serisawa treated footsores. Soldiers appreciated the gift ration from Mr. Churchill, and even simple fried leech. This underscored the grim contrast between glorious strategic victory and immense physical hardship. The common soldier bore the full weight of hunger and psychological strain. The rapid thrust that had secured Rangoon swiftly devolved. It became a grinding, miserable campaign defined not by glorious charges, but by logistics, mud, and disease. The Japanese advance stalled. The front line transformed into a hardship front, Antitania. The most lethal enemies were cholera and malaria. The command structure established specialized units to respond to these disasters. The 11th Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit, or EPWSU, was one such unit. It was tasked with ensuring sanitation in a tropical environment. Sickness spread here faster than any enemy force could fight. The EPWSU's work was essential, yet often overlooked. After the fall of Mandalay, they settled in Taungi. They deployed advanced porcelain microfilters to purify water. This was a desperate measure during the dry season, when wells dried up quickly. They vaccinated local villagers against cholera. They treated skin diseases and toothaches. They often shared meals and conversation with the Burmese people. As offered a brief, peaceful interlude that starkly contrasted with the violence elsewhere. But even the best preparation could not prevent catastrophe. A severe cholera outbreak swept through the ranks. It quickly weakened troops already subsisting on meager rations. Soldiers suffered debilitating vomiting and dehydration. The army faced a critical shortage of sterile water and Ringer's solution. In this moment of utter desperation, resourcefulness became the key to survival. An unconventional, last-ditch treatment was attempted. They injected palm fruit juice directly into the veins of the sick. Remarkably, this measure worked. It halted the collapse of several units and saved numerous lives. It underscored the brutal, improvised nature of survival in the Burmese jungle. Compounding the biological threat was the strategic reality of superior Allied firepower. This was particularly true with the introduction of tanks. Japanese infantry, armed with standard-issue rifles and light machine guns, were often helpless. They stood little chance against the advancing British Mark III armour. Early engagements forced the infantry to adapt quickly. They relied on a desperate close-quarters, do-or-die spirit. At Monywa, one of the first tactical successes against armour occurred. A single mountain gun was disassembled and carried uphill. It managed to pierce the vulnerable tracks of a Mark III tank. This stalled the behemoth and boosted morale. The crucial tactical lesson was clear. The enemy was not invincible, but defeating them required suicidal bravery and pinpoint accuracy. Soldiers learned to fashion petrol bombs and use magnet mines. They prepared to charge into the path of the oncoming armour. They knew full well that they might not return. The focus of the fighting soon shifted to the Arakan region. The Japanese aimed to consolidate their position around the key airfield at Akiab. The strategic objective was achieved in early 1942, but the British launched a costly, unsuccessful attempt to retake it by May 1943. Here, the campaign became a pure grind. Japanese forces established a forward defensive line. They were immediately confronted by the overwhelming logistical and artillery superiority of the British. The psychological toll of constant shelling was immense. At Donbaik, on February 18th, the Japanese endured a bombardment described as far fiercer than any they had yet encountered. An estimated 500 to 600 shells per hour rained down. Communication instantly collapsed. In one bunker, Lance Corporal Ishii found himself among only 3 survivors. He feared they were the last men of their platoon. Every minute stretched into an eternity under the deafening percussion of the explosions. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the pervasive dust of pulverized earth. This obscured vision and amplified the fear. The sheer volume of fire was described by one survivor as being like hitting innumerable drums. They lay motionless, utterly dependent on the structural integrity of their makeshift shelters. They endured the pain and fear as wounded comrades cried out for their parents. This relentless, grinding reality provided the backdrop for a new, unsettling threat. It signaled a fundamental shift in Allied capability. In February 1943, General Audie Wingate's 3,000 long-range penetration troops crossed the Chindwin River. They were known as the Chindits. While the material results of this first expedition were poor for the British, the psychological impact on the Japanese was profound. The Chindits demonstrated the feasibility of effective jungle warfare deep behind enemy lines. They disrupted supply chains and puzzled the Japanese command. This new tactic used air support to penetrate dense, previously impassable terrain. It was a clear signal that the era of uncontested Japanese dominance in the jungle was over. The British were learning how to fight. The long, brutal road to ultimate defeat was beginning to open. 1944, spring. The strategic blunders that had plagued the early campaign found their grotesque culmination. Driven by the aggressive, almost delusional ambition of Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, the commander of the 15th Army, the Japanese High Command launched Operation Yugo. This was the invasion of Imphal and Kohima. It was an offensive predicated on audacity and fatal underestimation. They underestimated the enemy, the terrain, and the logistical realities. Mutaguchi, who reportedly drew inspiration from the campaigns of Genghis Khan, issued his orders. They expected his divisions to advance by living off captured Allied supplies. His logistical plan was a tragic farce. Troops were ordered to rely on animal transport, including elephants. They expected 20,000 oxen, which were supposed to serve as both transport and moving rations. In reality, only a paltry 1,000 oxen were ever procured. The 15th, 31st, and 33rd Divisions were already under strength. They were flung across the Chindwin River with critically insufficient supplies. Each man carried a back-breaking load. They often carried 40 to 50 kilograms of ammunition and rations. These rations were meant to last barely 2 weeks. Simple rest became a monumental effort. Soldiers often needed assistance just to stand up again. The initial advance, though brutal, quickly stalled. It stalled against the concentrated, well-supplied British Indian forces. The battles of Kohima and Imphal became meat grinders. Japanese tactical doctrine relied on close-quarters combat and night infiltration. This doctrine was systematically dismantled by the Allies' overwhelming air superiority and massive artillery barrages. Nowhere was this tactical failure more brutally apparent than at Sangshak in mid-March 1944. At Ura, the 2nd Battalion of the 31st Division attempted a crucial night attack against British Indian positions. The enemy was ready. As the Japanese infantry advanced, they were met not by scattered rifle fire. They were met by a wall of concentrated automatic weapons and fierce machine gun fire. The attack was repulsed with staggering losses. It exposed a fatal flaw in Japanese preparation. Their mortars lacked crucial air-bursting shells. This rendered them ineffective against entrenched, dug-in defenders. The bodies piled up. The cost of a single objective was measured in hundreds of lives. As the weeks dragged on, the situation devolved from a flawed campaign into a strategic catastrophe. The onset of the monsoon season in mid-May was the final devastating blow. The jungle tracks turned into impassable quagmires. The deep, narrow foxholes soldiers had dug for shelter quickly flooded. These octopus traps became watery graves. Logistical lines, already threadbare, evaporated entirely. Allied cargo planes mocked the starving Japanese troops. They dropped supplies onto the Imphal plain for the defenders. The attackers were left to starve. The psychological and physical breakdown was complete. Regiments were decimated. The 4th Company of the 5th Division crossed the Manipur River with 90 men. Within 2 weeks they were reduced to just over 20 men. Boots rotted off their feet. Men were forced to bind their wounds and tattered shoes with jungle grass. The air filled with the pervasive, sickening smell of death and blood. Vultures circled endlessly above the burnt villages and shell craters, drawn by scattered corpses. In this landscape of total misery, the human spirit cracked. Soldiers stooped like old men, emaciated and crippled by malnutrition and disease. The retreat, which began in earnest in July 1944, became known to survivors as the Human Remains Highway. Tens of thousands perished from starvation, dysentery, and exhaustion. Discipline collapsed, and the most desperate acts became commonplace. Some soldiers, reaching the absolute limit of their endurance, chose suicide. They would pull the pin on a grenade, often in pairs, as a grim routine. Others stole from the dying. An emaciated arm would be raised in a final, futile gesture against the thief. The ritual of preparing for death became a profound act of dignity. Soldiers meticulously arranged their meager possessions to dry in the sun. They cut off little fingers or locks of hair to be cremated and sent home. They placed photographs of their families inside their helmets. The retreat along the Chindwin was an ordeal of desperate survival. One soldier, too ill to walk, watched his feet literally peel off with his shoes. His companion, Kano, refused to let him succumb. Kano embodied a brutal, desperate will to survive. He would physically drag the delirious man forward, forcing him to continue the agonizing march. The river itself offered no mercy. Men attempted to build makeshift bamboo rafts. The structures creaked and groaned under the turbulent currents. They often capsized, sweeping comrades away forever. The failure of Operation Imphal was the single biggest defeat suffered by the Imperial Japanese Army. It was a catastrophe that cost over 60,000 lives. It was not a defeat wrought purely by enemy action. It was caused by the hubris of stubborn generals, the failure of logistics, and the unforgiving reality of a war fought against nature itself. The human remains highway was the indelible testament to the immense, futile sacrifice of a generation of young men. The strategic failure of the Imphal offensive had fatally crippled the Burma Area Army. The final crushing blow came from the relentless Allied counter-offensive. It was spearheaded by the swift, decisive action of the British Fourth Corps. The war became a desperate defensive action, fought not for victory, but for survival. Along the great river barrier of the Irrawaddy, the last viable Japanese divisions were ordered to deny the Allied crossings at all costs. These were brutal, costly stands. Men fought with the knowledge that retreat was impossible and reinforcement was unlikely. The decisive battle, as intended by General Slim, was the capture of Meiktila in March 1945. Lieutenant Shuichiro Yoshino, deployed near the town, bore witness to the dawn that heralded annihilation. The jungle canopy was initially silhouetted against the rising sun, a moment of deceptive tranquility. Then, the sky filled instantly. It filled not with birdsong, but with the roar of British aircraft. The heavy, ominous rumble of tanks followed. Yoshino described the sheer terror of the shelling. He knew the enemy possessed total air superiority. They delivered not just fire, but the psychological certainty of impending doom. Following the fall of Meiktila and the capture of Purwabwe, the Japanese position in central and lower Burma became untenable. The subsequent withdrawal was not a strategic retreat, but a catastrophic, chaotic flight. Remaining units and support personnel were forced onto treacherous mountain routes. Their situation was compounded by the rebellion of the Burmese National Army in late March 1945. This rebellion turned the jungle into a labyrinth of guerrilla warfare. The plight of the medical staff exemplified the total breakdown of military order. Nurse Kiyomi, caught in the chaos after an attack near Wedang, found herself utterly isolated. Wandering through the dense jungle, she faced the immediate threat of Burmese rebels. She faced the agonizing certainty of starvation. The military machine that had promised glory and provision had abandoned her. They was forced to rely on desperate pleas for food from local families. This humbling and terrifying experience shattered any remaining illusion of imperial power. For the nurses who had endured constant air raids and exhausted marches, the psychological toll was immense. They witnessed their patients wasting away. In Rangoon, in July 1945, the news arrived that nurses Yoshiko and Sadami had committed suicide. They were unable to bear the weight of their suffering and the crushing reality of defeat. For many who survived, duty transcended personal pain. When the International Red Cross offered repatriation by plane, a significant number of nurses, including Kiyomi, refused. They were driven by a profound sense of duty to stay. They cared for the hundreds of wounded and sick Japanese soldiers still dependent on them. They preferred to face the uncertain fate of a defeated army than abandon their charges. The war officially ended on August 15, 1945, but the final accounting was grim. The Burma campaign was a graveyard where 305,501 Japanese soldiers and officers fought. 185,149 were killed or died of sickness. This was a staggering 61% mortality rate. It was caused by combat, disease, malnutrition, and starvation. The campaign profoundly challenges the wartime perception of the Japanese soldier as an inherent devil. It reveals them instead as frightened young men, fighting to the death, a war they did not understand. In this, they mirrored the suffering of their enemies. The final, poignant act of the campaign occurred during the surrender and repatriation. During a formal ceremony, a victorious British brigade commander approached the disarmed Japanese soldiers. Instead of a triumphal declaration, he offered a quiet, profound respect. He acknowledged their fighting ability. He encouraged them to return home and apply that same dedication to rebuilding their shattered nation. It was a gesture of unexpected humanity that deeply moved the defeated troops. For the few who returned, the emotional impact was indelible. The journey home continued into 1947, a slow trickle of survivors. They bore the scars of the human remains highway, One nurse arriving back at Otake in July 1946 was met by her weeping parents. They had already held her funeral. Its final, profound relief, mixed with the trauma of loss, symbolized the emotional abyss created by the Burma campaign. It was a catastrophic human experience that would forever define a generation. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories, and please share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.